Hi, my name is Jessica, and I will be comparing Johnson & Johnson with another company. We decided to use Pfizer to compare to Johnson & Johnson because in order to understand our stock better, we decided to compare it to a stock that's similar to our stock. Since they're both biopharmaceutical companies in the healthcare field, it will really help us see how it's actually doing within the market, within the industry. In order to do so, we decided to look at the profitability of both stocks. In order to do so, we looked at the gross profit margin and the operating margin of both companies. The gross profit margin of Johnson & Johnson is about 21%, as it's about 17% for Pfizer. And for operating margins, it's about 27% for Johnson & Johnson and 30% for Pfizer. So what this shows us is that has a bigger Pfizer's operating margin is much greater than Johnson & Johnson, when prior before that the gross profit margin is lower than Johnson & Johnson, which means that Pfizer is doing better in operations in comparison to Johnson & Johnson, thus the great increase. Next, we'll look at the management effectiveness of both companies. In order to do so, we decided to look at the return on investment ratio and the return on equity ratio. So what the return on equity ratio shows us is that Johnson & Johnson is about 20%, as Pfizer is around 12%. So this tells us that as a stockholder, we should invest our money in Johnson & Johnson because it gives us a greater return in comparison to Pfizer. So every single dollar that we invest in, we will receive around 20 cents back from our investment. This is a very important aspect for our stockholders because stockholders want returns, and a greater return is always better for a company. Now we can look at the return on investments, and Johnson & Johnson is around 9% and Pfizer is around 5%, and this tells us that Johnson & Johnson will be able to pay off much higher will be able to pay off their debts, even though their debts with allowing their debts with a higher interest rate. So it means that the rate that we can return on our investments is much higher for Johnson & Johnson. So overall, this tells us that Johnson & Johnson is doing better in management and compared to Pfizer. Next, we'll look at cash flow. Cash flow, according to Warren Buffett, cash is key, and having a greater cash flow always comes a greater advantage. We decided to look at the operating cash flow and the levered cash flow. Johnson & Johnson's operating cash flow is around 18 billion, Pfizer's is around 15 billion, and Johnson & Johnson's levered cash flow is around 12 billion, while Pfizer's is around 15 billion. So this shows us that the levered cash flow for Pfizer is much higher than Johnson & Johnson's, even though the operating cash flow is lower than Johnson & Johnson's. But this means that after they pay off their stockholder debts, their investments, their dividends, they will have a larger amount of cash that will be left over for other investments. Also, in addition, we decided to take a look at the revenue of both companies. Johnson & Johnson's revenue is around 70 billion right now, and Pfizer's is around 48 billion. And even though Pfizer has a much lower revenue in comparison to Johnson & Johnson, it shows a greater amount of cash flow that's remaining. So this shows that Pfizer is doing much better and have a much greater cash flow in comparison to Johnson & Johnson. Next, we'll look at the beta of both companies. Beta shows how risky the stock actually is. Johnson & Johnson's beta is 1.02, Pfizer's beta is 1.06, and what this tells us is that Johnson & Johnson stock is riskier than the market by 2%, and Pfizer's stock is riskier than the market by 6%. So overall, Pfizer is a riskier stock to investment in comparison to J&J. Next, lastly, we'll look at the price to earning ratio. We decided to look at three different types. We looked at the trailing PE ratio, the future ratio, and the PEG ratio. J&J's trailing ratio is lower in comparison to Pfizer. However, J&J's future PE ratio is higher in comparison to Pfizer's. And lastly, the PEG ratio is lower for J&J. So what this shows us is that Pfizer has a much greater growth rate in comparison to J&J in the future. So if you're looking down into, if you're looking to the later into the future, Pfizer might be a greater stock to investment if we're just looking at the PE ratio. Overall, this is the comparison between Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. Thank you very much.